I started out, as you may know, quite vociferously advocating a lockdown. I argued for a 3-week lockdown because the incubation period was 2 weeks. It was known to be 2 weeks maximum. And therefore, with a 3-week lockdown, you would have been able to break the back of an infection process that we assumed on the basis of the evidence provided about test to death ratios and test to severe outcome ratios to be about 3% in China.
Right.
So that was the foundation upon which I argued what I argued. Having said that, I mean, from the initial period of lockdown, I began to be critical about the way in which lockdown was being imposed and the measures being taken and so on. I argued at the beginning that the Labour movement, because we still had 500,000 people who supposedly were Corbynites, that they could have been mobilized in order to provide community support in the type of way in which the Cubans, the Venezuelans, the Vietnamese and the Chinese in some way or other did. In other words, having connections to people so they can call round on them, check how their health is, make sure the thing isn't spreading widely, and then within a few weeks the matter would be over. And here we are more than 6 months on with utter and complete chaos. And I think the mistake has been to, if you like, discuss COVID as a single issue as if it's driving the whole process, rather than, and I think that's a mistake in the sense of saying, in the same way as saying that the collateralized debt obligations or the ninja people in 2008 were responsible for the housing crash, which caused the economic collapse overall. And so the societal impact of the housing crash was often discussed by experts in finance and on business, but actually was nothing to do with the core elements of what was happening in society. And added to this, I followed very carefully the discussions between different levels of expertise and fields of expertise in Germany. And it happens to be, in my view, that the debates in Germany between the official viewpoint and the contrarian viewpoints have been extremely sophisticated, way more sophisticated than anything we've had here at all. I mean, there've been occasional person here or there, often generally focusing on civil liberties and things like that, but not dealing with the fundamental questions about what the virus is, what its impact is, what the death rates are, what the cures are, what the why the health services in different countries have collapsed, why it's spread to certain countries more than others, what the actual infection rate is, what the infection means or doesn't mean. And all that has been thrown into such a level of confusion that it really has taken a long time to get a grip on what is actually happening. And I do think this guy, Bhakdi, has summarized the totality of the viral issue and the disease. I do think he has really covered this extremely thoroughly. And I've seen the debates in the last few days since his book became a bestseller in Germany. And he's finally been allowed onto the radio and television. And all of the officials are squeaming in their seats and saying, yes, Mr. Bhakdi, you're right on this. Yes, Mr. Bhakdi, you're right on this. Yes, Mr. Bhakdi, you're right on this. And so this is not something that's going to go away. It is going to become, I think, the core of the debate over the next couple of months.
Is there one key point that Bhakdi makes that you would, probably more than one, but is there one key one?
Through some basics of the argument. The first argument is that what they are detecting with the PCR test is not an infectious disease. What they're detecting with the PCR test is the presence of a virus or parts of a virus in your body. Whether that is viable to infect you, as in make you ill, having got the virus in your body, is a totally different issue. And the way in which the tests are conducted, basically you get a swab in the back of your throat, which is difficult to do, by the way. It requires medical staff to do it. You can't do it at home, as they're telling you.
It's very difficult.
You can't do it in these places where you go to. I mean, a friend of mine went for a test last week, and this was the official testing thing. He went for a test, and they gave him two options. One is where you go for a test and the medical staff do it. And the other is where you go to a marquee and you're given a test kit and you do it yourself. I mean, I've only learned about these terminologies. So I'll repeat some of the terminologies to make it clear. An infection means that a virus, in this particular case, with a viral infection, it means it enters your body and it multiplies inside the cells. And the multiplication in the cells creates like something noticeable. For example, a pain in the neck or lung or bad coughing or something like that. That is an infection. Yeah? An infection is different from having a virus in your body. So those people who are infected and are asymptomatic are not infected. The argument he makes as well is that therefore they are not infectious. They cannot transmit because the virus isn't multiplying in their bodies. Asymptomatic transmission, he rules it out. And he's one of the top immunologists in the world. And madly, the guy who's been behind the whole thing, Christian Drosten in Berlin, he invented the PCR test, which the Chinese and everyone else has based their own tests upon. I heard him on the radio 2 days ago, and he said, literally, he was squeaming in his seat, and he said, well, immunology, he goes, well, that's a very difficult field. He goes, nobody in the world understands immunology, he says. And then he laughed and he said, well, at least I don't understand anything about it. Now, how can this guy be in charge of the global campaign to test people and supposedly to provide answers like vaccines and so on?
So as I understand that, Heiko, the test tells you that there's a virus in you, but that doesn't mean to say that you've been infected because you may have no symptoms and you're not going to infect anybody else as a result. Is that correct? That's correct,
yeah. What percentage of that, we don't know. Now, there was a discussion on this on Austrian television a few days ago where Bhakdi was present and one ex-minister, health minister, and another senior official in the present campaign, if you like, by the Austrian government was there. And he explained that, well, what he managed to get them to agree to was that it needs to be a single unified standard test, because there are multiple different tests in the market at the moment. They all show different things. And basically, when you test somebody, when the PCR test is taken, they check whether the virus is present in the body, or bits of it are present in the body. It can just be bits of it as well. And then they multiply it. Each of the cycles, they multiply up to 45 cycles. Each cycle multiplies the number by double. So if you need 1 million to test it, it means if you start out with a base load of 100 and you multiply it 10 times, you'll get 1 million. But if you start out with a base load of 1, you'll end up with 1 million after 17 multiplications. And so unless they know exactly how many multiplications they're going to do to test whether you are infected and infectious and likely to come down with disease, you don't have any standard in which being measured at all. You simply don't know what the test means, right? Except if you get the totality of infections, or better said, of the presence of the virus, and then you observe who actually becomes ill and who doesn't, who dies and doesn't, then of course you could say, okay, but then you'd have to know how the test was conducted and whether it determined anything.
Right.
So for example...
So the ratio of illness and death to tests is useless because we don't know if the tests are actually telling us.
It is definitely far, 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 far below the official figures. Like you gave 1%, I thought 3%. I began to lean towards what they'd said in Germany, which was about 0.26, 0.3%, because there was a study in Heinsberg that studied the actual community which had been infected. It's the actual done that. And they attacked it, but actually it's pretty sound study, really.
Sounds like it to me. It's still quite larger than influenza.
It was 0.3. Well, in Germany, sometimes you have influenza death rates of 0.4%. It depends on the circumstances and the year. For example, 2018 was a very severe influenza year in Germany, something like 18,000 people killed. This year in Germany, there's 10,000 people died from COVID-19. But then there is the question about deaths. What are the deaths? Well, the death rate in China was of those detected as tested was 3%. The British government at the time said, well, the numbers were probably completely wrong. Probably they had 10 or 20 times the numbers of people. In fact, one very interesting thing I found out this week was that the Chinese have stopped testing. They stopped testing in July after the Wuhan tests. They only do occasional tests in different areas. But otherwise, they don't do mass testing because they know. I mean, this is what some have said, and I don't know whether it's true, but supposedly they know that the tests are totally useless in the sense of gauging where you are at in an epidemic. Now, as far as the numbers are concerned, well, the official figures for antibody tests in London, and antibody tests don't actually detect all the cases because, you know, you could have had the thing 4 months ago and it might not show anymore in the antibody test.
Right.
So it's going to be higher than this probably. But in London, they say 17% have had it, which means 1.5 million people had it. And in London, about 4,900 people died. So I don't know what the figure of that is, but it's a very small percentage.
About 0.3, isn't it?
Right, there you go. So that would tie in with what's happened in quite a few European countries. But in Delhi, you know, I don't know the reliability of the test, but there's 5 million people, according to antibody studies, were infected in Delhi. And 50,000 were actually tested. And there are around 5,000 deaths. Or no, sorry, 4,000 something deaths. So in Delhi, it's 0.09%.
Yeah.
So,
does this mean it's all been a complete fucking waste of time and disaster? We should never have had lockdowns. We should never have had any attempt to control this. We should have just lived with it till we got the vaccine, and that this has been a total waste of time. Question one. Question two, if that's the case, why the hell did all these capitalist governments go through this panic? What were they worried about?
Yeah, I think, I mean, you know, obviously I have to justify myself to people as well. So I have turned around and said, well, you know, at the beginning, it looked like this was SARS gone mad, right? So first SARS, death rate of 10%, at least from detected cases. And so therefore it was
very dangerous.
Legitimate to think that a much more highly infectious and much more highly contagious spread would result in a far higher death rate, and therefore it appeared logical. And even Bhakdi says, at the beginning, you know, it was possible to argue that it was logical to do a lockdown. But I mean, he doesn't say, I don't think he ever said that you should do that, but I have heard him say it was understandable that he did it at the beginning. But then to continue, what he argues is that in Germany, for example, the epidemic was over in April. So the peak period that you had of deaths was the epidemic, and the rest of it is just hangovers. And the argument is that this particular coronavirus, if it's changed, for example, the Wuhan virus doesn't exist in the world anymore, but there are mutations from that virus which still exist and are circulating. It appears that they probably have a lower fatality rate anyway. With the new mutations, because a virus for its existence must survive on living hosts, and therefore it cannot survive by simply killing people. And the likelihood then is that this present coronavirus will simply enter into the general coronaviruses, which constitute about 15% of all flu-like illnesses and cold-like illnesses every winter. And therefore, it will not be any more serious than that. As regards treatment, we've discovered that, I mean, there are large-scale studies on hydroxychloroquine. A normal dose is 200 to 400 milligrams, can be taken prophylactically and by patients they found in Belgium. I don't remember the figure. I can send you this. I'll send the study to all of you afterwards. But it showed an enormously different outcome rate, both in time in hospital and in fatalities. The other thing is prophylactic consumption of vitamin D. Fauci apparently is taking 6,000 international units of vitamin D a day, corresponding with age and so on. So vitamin D is an essential component. And many people in Europe suffer from a lack of vitamin D. And in Sweden and Norway, for example, they put vitamin D in the food because they don't get vitamin D in the summer. The reason why one reason there may be an increase in actual illnesses now from COVID-19 is because vitamin D, of course, is going down with the sun disappearing. And therefore, people's vitamin D supplementation should be secured. Well, I mean, I've been to the doctor and they say, take extra vitamin D, you're low on D, you know, which is all about immune response.
Yeah.
The second thing is we didn't know until, well, there was a very detailed study carried out in Tübingen about a month and a half ago, which showed that 81% of people have got a T-cell memories response. And there's two types of response to an illness. One is an antibody response, which tries to prevent the the virus from entering the cell. And the other is when the virus enters the cell, it multiplies inside the cell and expels waste material from that multiplication process. T cell memory is called T cell. There are two types, basically, one called helper, one called killer. And basically what they do is they detect this wastage thrown out from the cell, and then they attack and kill the cell. And so it's believed that cross-reactivity with the other four coronaviruses, rhinovirus, human coronavirus, and so on, that have been in circulation possibly for millennia, that they constitute a sufficient memory to provide immunity in the sense of an ability of the body to fight off the disease for up to 81% of the population. So it is in Tübingen study. Drosten himself argues that there was he cites a study from America, I believe it is, where 30 to 40% had T cell immunity, which would mean that herd immunity has existed all along. That's the point. Because they argued we need to build herd immunity by getting everyone infected. And that sounded, like I said at the time, like you said at the time, this means culling the masses. But actually, if T cell immunity is the key to the immunity, then we've had herd immunity all along. And who've been affected have been affected because of a lack of protection of the old and the vulnerable. The most vulnerable, as Hall study in the Lancet says, the vulnerable are those who have two or more comorbidities which can be treated reasonably well, but are not treated well because the health services in Britain, France, Spain, and Italy, possibly Belgium as well, have not been expanding in correspondence with the expansion of the economy, and instead of that have been subject to privatization and all the other cuts in services that we know.
Well, they haven't done anything about obesity, have they?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, apart from Boris Johnson doing press-ups. Apparently obesity, I did see somewhere obesity has actually been overplayed. It's mainly respiratory illness and heart disease.
Right, diabetes, stuff like that.
The other thing about the numbers then, which connects in with this is I always thought this was nonsense at the beginning, but the more you look into it, it's unavoidable. The definition of with COVID and from COVID is a fundamental thing. From COVID appears to be about 20% of the deaths. With COVID appears to be 80% of the deaths. So these are people who are, it's not like you're saying there, oh, I'm 70, I'm at risk. You're not at risk. Unless you've got I don't know what illnesses you might have, unless you've got some serious respiratory problem or heart problem, you're not at risk. Yeah, Donald Trump is almost certainly not at risk.
No, not at any greater risk than anybody else.
Yes. There will be people of my age, younger, who have a serious comorbidity and who can be killed by it. But they could be killed by a number of other, my brother had open heart surgery recently. If he was to get infected during the period of 3 or 4 weeks afterwards, even with the flu, he can die. So, the argument. So the question you're asking, why have they done what they've done?
Yes.
I think it's a mixture of reasons. I think what happened is the Chinese process was due to the fear that if there were large numbers of deaths and a SARS-type scenario hit the whole of China, this could have been, if you like, undermine the authority of the government to control and organize society. And I think that's fundamental to that. So they carry out in classical form, as everything we've seen from Xinjiang to Hong Kong to, they take a dramatic, when first they make mistakes at the bottom, unrest begins to circulate, which was probably heated up because of the Li Wenliang issue. By the Western media who jumped on it and screamed out, oh, look, the Chinese can't cope, the government's about to collapse. And Bannon and Cole jumped on the bandwagon. And so the Chinese reacted to that with the measures that they knew would work. Because, yes, a proper lockdown will work. Of course it will. Will it stop new infections? No, but it will completely stop that present wave. And that they succeeded in doing. The second aspect to it is that the bureaucratic institutions in the West, like the health service, the scientific community, and all the rest of it, which are linked to, on the one side, acquiring state resources, and on the other side to private businesses with all sorts of peculiar interests behind them. They got, if you like, a shot in the arm from this panic, if you like. So they were able to mobilize enormous government resources to be thrown their way.
That's sort of after the event, isn't it? I mean, they made a decision. They were going to try and, that this was serious enough to close down the whole capitalist economy.
Well, once you get going, it's difficult to stop. And it happened to correspond with the general collapse, the general crisis of capitalism. And therefore, they kept having to pump new money. And so, for example, if you look at the process that happened in Britain, Rishi Sunak, first of when he made his budget, it was like 30 billion. And then a few days later, 300 billion. So it was a panic mode that emerged within these layers, partly as a result of their obsession with modeling. You know, I mean, you must know that from the financial world. Once they start modeling, it never stops. You know, and so it was with Ferguson and the rest of them. I mean, Ferguson has got
the political level, you could have taken the view, look, this, which is what's certainly somebody thought doing, this isn't really serious enough. It's not serious enough. We don't need to lock down. We just need to take the small precautions we take with a new flu epidemic, and the economies can go forward. We don't need to lock down and destroy the economy, which is what they're all saying now, of course. What you're really saying is that they misjudged the risk involved. They felt that the risk was so high to millions of people that they would politically be disastrous if they didn't do a lockdown, because then everybody would hit them for saying you've done nothing, you just want us to die, and they'd all be out on their asses. So they went for it, lockdowns, because they don't have any sort of medical backing to deal with this at any level that would be necessary, particularly in the levels of capacity for taking people who got ill. So they went for the lockdowns because the alternative was political disaster if they didn't do anything. And therefore now they've gone all the way to spend the money, and now they're in total confusion. They don't know whether to come out of it, whether to stay in it, and they're split about what to do.
First, it was important. The images from China, first of all, they all thought that would stay in China. You know, and that China, some of them even thought I would bring down the Communist Party in China. Then, when it reached Italy, the mood changed. And the Italian scenes on television, all the rest of it, led to the fear that the NHS and health services in different countries would collapse. This whole idea about flattening the curve, maintaining the NHS alive. And this attitude was taken in all the European countries. In fact, of course, in some ways, the correct attitude.
Yeah.
But in actual fact, if you look back over the last few years, the death rate has been going, you know, the age, life expectancy has been going, not really increased anymore. Death rate's been going up over a number of years. National Health Service has been on the edge of crisis. Every time they said winter flu, how will the NHS cope? So it was only one little thing pushing it over the edge. And it happened to be in Britain, the thing was the lack of masks for staff, you know, the lack of testing for staff. You know, the tests are no good, but they can still test something. I mean, at least you could have protected, ring-fenced the NHS, you could have ring-fenced the care homes. And they didn't even ring-fence the care homes in Sweden.
No.
Sweden did not have to have hardly any deaths. But because the care homes have been privatized or the provision for care homes been privatized, that's why people died.
Also, they've done absolutely no research on these COVIDs and coronaviruses beforehand. They haven't prepared in advance, pharmaceutically wise, to deal with, get vaccines prepared, because they knew this stuff was out there. And I'm tending away from the vaccines, unfortunately. Again,
yeah,
well, whatever, the treatments anyway. They knew these viruses were here. They knew that pandemics could happen, or epidemics, but even pandemics of varying degrees. They had no idea. They hadn't done any work on the dangers involved in these things. They just ignored it because it meant spending money on the health system, which they didn't want to do.
Well, I mean, the conspiracy theories do have validity in this, in that there were plans for pandemics, and these plans have been proposed and suggested by various interest groups and individuals who are all significant players in the present crisis. Neil Ferguson, Christian Drosten, Ted Drosten, the rest of them, Bill Gates and so on. They've all been plugging this for quite a few years, if you like, as outsiders, you know, warning of death and destruction. And in the crisis that emerged, these people became extremely influential. and their agenda then, became suddenly top of the list. And if you do look at Ferguson's record on swine flu, and on the other, swine flu, MERS, SARS, he was predicting millions of deaths almost pretty much for every single one. It's his standard modus operandi. And therefore, the fact that there was already a crisis, the crisis of capitalism, the jitteriness of the capitalists, the fact that governments, when they went into panic mode, effectively ceased all genuine investigation, questioning and inquiry and cross-examination. When they passed these laws, then of course all the media were also corralled, and the media was so you never asked any serious questions anyway. I mean, when supposedly it would have, or when it would have been useful to have masks, they refused to ask even the question, why aren't we having masks? And then when the whole pandemic was over in terms of death, significant increase in death rates, then all of a sudden masks were introduced, and then all the media was screaming about how wonderful masks are, and without even looking at what they said the week before. Yeah. And so they've created this utter confusion, both in their own minds. I think that's true. I don't think they're clear in their own minds.
No.
And then there's a conflict of interest between different groups of capital. I mean, they've been giving money away hand over fist to the petty bourgeoisie. So, these small business loans, they've been handing them out hand over fist. And so really small businesses, actually small limited companies, maybe did nothing. Suddenly got 50 grand out of nowhere. And then other businesses have done, got some of this finance as well. Obviously, some businesses have taken a massive hit.
Yeah.
But if you like, the sphere which has an obvious affinity together with modelers, behavioral scientists and all that, is the tech sector. And they've done extraordinary.
Rather than prolong the thing, let's accept that argument now. What happens in the future then? Because there's going to be new viruses coming. Are the attitude going to be have governments learned from this? Is this just not going to be an issue anymore? Or are we going to face a whole series of panics over the next 10 years? Heiko's argument is, following Bhakdi, is that there is nothing to worry about. There is no high death rates, no worse than the flu. This has all been an overkill, and possibly understandable that we didn't know what it was to begin with. But actually, governments around the world have overkilled on a virus that turns out to be no worse than flu, and nobody's prepared to admit this, and so they're continuing with this mess. And that is what Bhakdi is telling us.
We're Marxists. We want to see the overthrow of capitalism. We can't expect medical people to adopt that point of view, unless, of course, your overall perspective about how society should be changed incorporates issues which are of their concern and which correspond with their knowledge about how health and welfare can be improved. So that means how society has changed to serve the needs of the people. Now, what they're saying is medicine has been misused as an excuse to impose draconian measures on the people and to impoverish millions of people around the world, hundreds of millions of people around the world, and also to Uberize the workforce, to turn them into Zoom producers rather than teachers and all the rest of it.
You think that was a deliberate policy? Wasn't that just an accident, you could say? That it was just, they didn't know it was, they thought it was terrible. They had to do something, otherwise they'd have been in political trouble. Then they find out that it isn't so bad, but they don't know what to do now.
Well, but they've already committed 100 billion to the moonshot program, which requires mass testing. So therefore, they're not going to abandon that. If you spend 100 billion on it.
No, that's because they'd look idiots if they suddenly turned around and said, actually, it's not a problem after all.
Partly, but it's also because they've got this machine operating and that's pushing them in that direction. And the other thing is because they thought they'd make a load of money out the vaccines. But it's quite obvious they're not going to be able to do it before China.
I'm also convinced about making loads of money out of the crisis. I'm more convinced about two arguments. First, there's the health argument. Is it dangerous or not? Perhaps you didn't know at the beginning. Perhaps you might know now. I'm not even sure you do know now. That's one thing. And then the second question is the political reaction to that. and the ability to deal with it. In a way, you're correct, Heiko, that the two things are separate, but what Bhakdi is presumably presenting to us is a health argument. He's saying, look, this isn't a problem after all. But then he throws in all this crap about conspiracy from what you're telling me.
He doesn't.
But maybe he's not bringing that in, but other people do. And you are then. You're bringing the conspiracy theory that they're trying to make money out of. I don't know the capitalists are that clever. I don't think they thought of that.
It's not that. That's what I'm saying. First, they throw them. The government says, what can we do? At the beginning of lockdown, they said, we're going to do three things: protect the people, protect the NHS, lock people up for a little while, and develop a vaccine program, do research. Once they embarked on that and threw money in that direction, then of course they keep upping that all the time. And all the other governments are upping that all the time. And then the British realise, is what I think, okay, this is my view of what's happened, not conspiracy, but I don't know exactly, so I can't confirm one way or another. We'll know eventually one day. But they tried to throw the money, and then they realised they're not going to win on the vaccine front. So then they suddenly had some advisors from Dominic Cummings' team who said, okay, let's do a testing program. No one's doing that properly, so we can conquer the world market for testing by doing 10 million tests a day. I mean, it's not rocket science to work that out. That's what they've said they're doing.
I think it is rocket science to assume that they're doing it because they want to make money out of testing. I think they're doing it because they think that might be a solution, that they can control it this way. They're now into it. And if they can pick up a few private contracts on the way, fair enough. But I'm not sure that the issue is getting private contracts. We have to go on forever about this, but there is the question of whether this is a dangerous virus or not, and whether it's killing people or making people more severely ill than otherwise would have been the case from all the other things that people can die from when they're unhealthy or old than before. The evidence is still out, the jury is still out on that. It still seems that it is a bit more dangerous, maybe sometime more dangerous than flu and other possibilities. But Bhakdi says, no, it's not. Okay, well, I've heard that argument before. We can continue that discussion, and I don't think we can solve it. Then there's the question of what the political response is, how to deal with this. And my view is that the governments, Western governments, have assumed that it's dangerous, having not been convinced to begin with and doing fuck all about it. Then it's dangerous, and they can't cope with it because they don't have the way and they can cope for it in China through a planned economy. So the result is that we have this terrible mess that they can't get out of. Half of them want to just open it up and forget, let the whole thing happen. Half of them are holding on. It's going to be three halves. Half of them are going to hold on to waiting for the vaccine to save the day. And the other lot will continue to try and find some sort of testing and lockdown process to try and control it and hope it will eventually go away. But I don't see a conspiracy on the part of the capitalist governments to make money out of the pandemic. Well, sure, people are making money out of it, but also governments are losing a hell of a lot because the economy's down the chute. They want to get the economy back up and running, capitalist firms back up and running, making money. It's okay for a few private contractors and face mask and test contractors to make money, but that's no good to Boeing. That's no good to our Rolls-Royce. That's no good to all these companies which are the bedrock of capitalist production. They've got to get those things back up and running, and that's what they're desperately looking for, a way to do that. At the moment, they're not sure how to get out of that, and they see a winter wave coming, and they're going to have to do more lockdowns. I've looked at the data today. The economies are not coming back fast enough. They're coming back a bit, but nowhere near fast enough. They're going to be way, 15, 20% below where they were at the end of 2019 by the end of this year and into next year. That is an absolute catastrophe for the capitalist economy. And making money out of a few testing machines and other things is not a reason for this to continue.
Well, I'm not actually arguing that's the reason for that continue. I'm saying that's what's happening. So in other words, the government doesn't know what they're doing. They don't understand about capitalism, capitalist crisis and so on.
Is it a conspiracy to make money? Or just...
No, I'm saying that once they throw money in one direction, that's one trajectory they're going in. You can't 1 week later say, oh, ban that.
In hindsight, and perhaps he's saying, oh, look, you should never have done this in the first place.
Well,
that's what he's saying, because if you'd known what this thing is, you wouldn't have been that worried about it. It's the political point is, if you want from the Marxist point of view, is that capitalism is in trouble. It can't handle these situations. The fact is that we're now in a position where capitalist economy is 20% below where it was at the end of last year. That's a fucking disaster. And the way they could get out of it is to let things rip and take Bhakdi's advice that it doesn't matter. But politically, that's almost impossible to carry out.
Why?
And therefore,
why is it politically impossible to carry out?
Well, they may go to that in the end, Heiko, because they've got no alternative. But at the moment, politically, they can't see that if they were to say, forget about the lockdowns, forget about testing, because Chinese aren't anyway, forget about health systems, because not many people are going to die, tell people that, and we're just going to open up the economy and we're going to get things going. That may come to that because the vaccines won't work. But at the moment, they're worried if they go down that road, then wherever they've got an election, Boris doesn't have one. I mean, he's already down the chute in the polls, but that means nothing because it's 3 or 4 years away. Trump is about to lose the election because of the shambles he's made of this, unless he can get the Proud Boys to occupy White House. Disaster politically for the incumbent governments. They don't know what to do. So they're in a position of not going for opening up because that could be disastrous politically. But lockdowns aren't working either. And more like they're just hoping, like Bhakdi has said, that Bhakdi's right and there won't be too many deaths. And by this time next year, they'll be in a position they've got a vaccine and death rates pretty low and everybody's no longer worried about it and they can restore the economy.
The argument about Bhakdi has nothing to do with politics. He is not.
No, it's a medical issue.
A medical thing.
Yeah.
Significantly.
It's whether you accept his argument and evidence as against other people's. You can take a view on it.
I've looked at different arguments, but I mean, all I've done is send it to you. You can look yourselves and check yourselves.
Yeah.
I'm not asking you to accept anything on faith on the basis that I've read something here. This is what's true. But what I've studied, and I've spent quite a lot of time doing that over the last 6 months, I can't find fault with the argument.
Fair enough.
As regards the sociological and economic impacts, I mean, you've covered the economic structure and way in which the dynamics of capitalism are developing, but there are factions within capitalism who are competing for power. There are different factions, finance capital and tech capital. There's quite a different interest to the airline industry and to shipping industry. And then there are battles between the different capitalist states around these things, which have dovetailed together with this particular crisis. And, when we've got a very significant...
The executive committee of the bourgeoisie has to make a decision on occasions, and it does do, different places.
Right, and what they've done is they've centralized executive power in almost every single capitalist state in the world in a way that has never been seen before since at least wartime.
Yes, but that wasn't a policy of deliberate... That wasn't deliberate. That's what the implication here politically is. They didn't allow COVID to happen so that they could have the concentration of executive power. They've moved to a concentration of executive power in some places because of the crisis that they're in, and that's the only way they can deal with it. They can't involve the population because that would be disastrous.
Well, there you go.
But that's not the same thing saying as a conspiracy to achieve.
I said different factions within the ruling class. I mean, you're also using the word "they do this."
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is, it's not they, it's different factions of the ruling class battling it out in the real environment that we live in, where there is an economic crisis, where COVID has happened. One section is doing one thing, another section is doing another thing. Once they start the ball rolling, they don't just stop.
A huge dilemma of either piling in a load more money, which I'm not sure they're going to do, or letting a whole bunch of people just be unemployed and a whole bunch of small businesses go bust and some big ones. The factions are divided on this, to use Heiko's view, about what direction to go on. And one day, if you take the UK position, whatever his name is, Sunak says we got to, save people. And the next day he says we can't keep spending money. They're not sure which way to go. And they're still fingers crossed that somehow the vaccine or the thing will die away. And maybe it will. Maybe they'll get through it and they'll find out that if the death rates, if the death rates stay as low as they are at the moment, despite the rise in infections, before the year is out, there'll definitely be talk of saying, well, the health systems are not under pressure, they can cope with this, so we don't need to continue with lockdowns, we can open up the economy, we can stop spending money on people, and that's quite a possibility by the end of the year, I think. And then we'll move back to, but the economies won't be back normal, but they'll just argue that things are normal and they can now try to go into 2021 with a better perspective ahead, particularly if eventually we get the vaccine. I think that's the most likely environment. Whether we have autocratic dictatorships taking over from so-called bourgeois democracies as a result of this, I don't really see it. It's a possibility, but I don't see it. I think the bourgeois democracies, on the whole, will survive this.
I don't see that either short term, but I do think it's like Ed Snowden said, once you get used to operating in a certain way, it's difficult to get out of that.
Yeah, true.
And therefore, the ability to reimpose these type of controls for all sorts of other reasons will clearly be there.
Yeah.
Once you've had it, if you've got a serious panic, you can just declare a health emergency if you really, are under threat, in order to justify doing X, Y, and Z. And the consequence of the world having gone through this experience will mean that the tolerance level for this type of thing will be higher than it would have been otherwise.
I think that's right. I mean, you can see that the UK government is clearly trying to centralise things, even dispense with the official civil service, operate under the control of the particular faction it's in control of government at the moment. Same thing with Trump in the White House, although he's probably going to lose out. But in Hungary and in Poland and in Turkey, we see similar positions. There could be a reaction to that, though.